so we have established the precedent that a military response is part of our set of options should chemical weapons be used. Tom, good morning. Good to be with you.
Let's talk about the state of the war itself in Ukraine then. Ukraine's forces are going on the offensive. They're taking some ground, and Russian troops instead seem to be digging in where they are. What's your reading of where the conflict has got to right now? Is Vladimir Putin, for example, reducing his war aims?
Well, I think he's had to. It's clear that he was hoping for a quick and decisive victory. And early on, it became apparent that the Russian campaign was not going to achieve that. And that is owing to the heroic resistance of the Ukrainians, but ably supported by arms supplies and actually over the past few years, training, etc., from Western countries. And so at least in the short term, he's had to adjust his aims. It looks as though the current tactical Russian priority is to consolidate the territory in the border areas, particularly in the south, that they've already taken, linking the Donbass to Crimea. But it is really welcome to see that the Ukrainians have managed to regain the initiative in some areas rather than simply being on the defensive, and are putting considerable pressure on Russian forces. That said, we do need to keep in mind the overwhelming capabilities the Russians can bring to bear. And one of the big risks in this campaign is that as their initial effort has stalled, is that as we've already seen, we see more and more targeting and brutality against the civilian population. And I think that's the most worrisome element of their shift of tactics.
And you've met Vladimir Putin, the man, a few times yourself in your various roles in government. What's your take on his sanity, if you like? Do you buy the theory that he has gone mad for one reason or another, or is this just a catastrophic miscalculation? And if it is, how do you think he'll choose to get out of it?
I don't know how he'll choose to get out of it. I have met him, and I don't buy all the pop psychology we've seen, but it is striking that his demeanour is completely different to the man I've encountered on a few occasions, where he was highly ruthless but also highly rational. And I think people who've seen him close up more recently, including, for example, President Macron, who said he was a different man to the man he'd met only a couple of years before. He's clearly grossly miscalculated, and that is partly, I suspect, because no one in his own system is now prepared to give him the blunt truth that if he believed or wanted to believe that they could have a quick and decisive victory, how many people would tell him that that was a risk. And it's very difficult to see now what the stable outcome of this is, whether that's through peace talks or through the war itself reaching stalemate.
Let's talk about NATO's response now. NATO allies met, of course, last week an extraordinary meeting. Now, so far, I think everyone has to admit all of the West and NATO's actions, whether it's sanctions or arming Ukraine's forces, though helpful, have not stopped the war. The killing goes on. In your view, is NATO at this present day doing enough to change that?
I think NATO, having decided for good reasons that NATO nations would not become militarily involved in defending Ukraine at this stage, then it was inevitable that the war would go on for a period, and NATO therefore equipping Ukrainian forces and enabling them to defend their own country effectively has actually been an effective response. And there are obvious reasons why NATO decided not to become militarily engaged, because of the risk of a more general confrontation with Russian forces. And so I think NATO's response has been effective. I was pleased to see after the summit President Biden's rather stronger language on the use of chemical weapons. I think that is a threshold we must ensure is not crossed into the use of weapons of mass destruction. So far, therefore, I think the NATO response has been effective in supporting the Ukrainians and applying sanctions, trying to defend NATO territory and deter further Russian incursions is an effective set of measures.
Let's talk a bit more about that. But you brought up the chemical weapons response and what President Biden and the other NATO allies said. They would respond in kind. All of the NATO leaders did, however, refuse to say exactly how they would respond. Can you give some sort of indication of what that response should be, and should it be military?
Well, they've deliberately kept it ambiguous, and I think that is well judged. But that means that a military response, depending on the exact circumstances of any use of chemical weapons, is an option, and it should be. There's been a lot of talk about the consequences of not responding militarily after the red line was set in Syria back in 2012 and 2013, which undoubtedly, in my view, prolonged the Syrian civil war. People forget we did respond militarily thereafter. There were two further major chemical weapons attacks by the Assad regime, and first the Americans, and then the Americans with the UK and France alongside took military action to dismantle the Syrian chemical weapons capability, but also to deter them from using them again. And so we have established the precedent that a military response is part of our set of options should chemical weapons be used. And I think it is right that, as I said, President Biden has left it ambiguous, but he's clearly left the military option available should the circumstances merit it. NATO has, let's not forget, been really clear. There is a threshold that if Russia crossed would elicit a military response, and that is an incursion into NATO territory. He's now setting a second threshold with, as I say, a deliberately ambiguous response in mind. I think that's well judged.
The thing is, you could interpret that ambiguity as a sign of strength or a sign of weakness, because he's also deliberately not saying this will incur a military response as an attack on any NATO ally would. So there is, of course, a red line there, but it's also pinkifiable, isn't it? Because the allies could easily also decide not to respond militarily, and only they said they will. That might be a proper deterrent.
There's clearly a case for a more hawkish position, and many of us, I guess, would instinctively sort of be at that end of the argument. But deterrence right the way through the Cold War involved deliberate ambiguity about exactly what kind of response would be made by NATO, a defensive alliance, let's not forget, to a, in that case, Soviet attack. And we had the doctrine in the 80s of flexible response, which was therefore deliberately trying to create uncertainty in the minds of our adversaries about exactly what might happen were they to take a particular step. And I think that is what President Biden is seeking to do in this case, and therefore warn the Putin government that the use of chemical weapons would elicit a response. He said it would elicit a response, but the nature of that response to be determined according to the circumstances of the time. The objective of that is not to set out response, is to deter their use. And I think it is really important that the Russian government understands that message.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about that hawkish response away from the use of chemical and biological weapons. So President Zelensky, one of the things he asked those NATO leaders was to send 1% of all their fighter planes and tanks to his country. Now, there is obviously a disagreement across NATO whether that should happen. Our Prime Minister warned that it'd be very difficult, but he certainly didn't rule it out and wants to think about it. Other NATO countries, perhaps the French, are keen not to. Obviously, we saw the Americans block that consignment of Polish MiG-29s going into Ukraine. What should NATO do? Should they now move on to the next step, if you like, up its response and start supplying actual military hardware, tanks, planes?
Well, they have supplied considerable military hardware already, which has enabled the Ukrainians to disrupt the Russian campaign. And so anti-aircraft, shoulder launched anti-aircraft, anti-tank weapons and so on have been really effective, along with the training that the Ukrainian forces have been given. And so I think this is a matter of judgment as we go through this campaign, depending on the military requirements of the time. It is quite right and quite natural that President Zelensky is going to ask for the maximum possible to give him the maximum capability possible to disrupt and hopefully
there are his requirements. He's laid out his requirements, what he needs then and there. Should NATO listen and start giving him those planes?
Well, I think NATO is listening very carefully, but there have been a series of judgments, and I can understand this. I'm no longer in government. I don't think NATO can simply provide everything that is that President Zelensky has been seeking simply on the basis that it would help the Ukrainian forces, because NATO also has to make this judgment about the risks of escalation. And that's something that governments have been working their way through, and is clearly a live debate among governments. I think we should and will continue to offer more military hardware. I think it's really important that the military hardware flows. And so those categories of weapon that we have said we will provide, particularly those that enhance the defensive capability of the Ukrainian forces, we need to make sure that those are arriving at speed and in the numbers the Ukrainians require. And then it will just have to be a matter of political and military judgment as to whether bigger, more offensive weapon systems are an appropriate measure as well.
It's a funny thing. I mean, you said a moment about that you and others might be on the more hawkish end of things. I'd like to ask you what you meant by that. Every time I interview a politician, they tell me we can't possibly go any further in terms of involving ourselves militarily in the war. Every time I speak to a military person, a retired general, David Richards, former CDS, who you know, Philip Breedlove, a former US SACA, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, they say we can go further. We can establish safe zones, for example, as long as we don't come into conflict with Russian troops. We can push President Putin a bit further than we're pushing because Russia doesn't want a war with NATO. They're already bogged down in Ukraine as it is. Where are you on that argument? Can we go further than perhaps the politicians feel they can go in the moment, exploiting the current weakness that Putin's obviously showing in Ukraine?
I think this is something we should always be testing. I mean, actually, you mentioned safe zones, and I think that was one of the ideas that was considered very, very early on, when the fear was the Russians would move through Ukrainian territory swiftly, and we might need safe zones in order to deal with the refugee flows and so on. Actually, the success of the Ukrainian resistance means that most of Ukrainian territory, certainly Western Ukrainian territory, remains in Ukrainian hands, and indeed much of the East as well. So these issues we have to consider and have to adapt according to the progress of the war on the ground. We should always be testing whether there is more we can do to put pressure on both the Russian military effort and indeed the Russian government. And that's why before the NATO summit, when I was speaking earlier this week, I did advocate a firmer line on the use of chemical weapons than we'd seen by that point. And as I said, I'm really pleased to see that we've now got that firmer line coming out of the NATO summit, and in particular from the President of the United States. I think there's some other things that we can do in terms of putting pressure on the regime. Clearly, there's going to be further effort on economic sanctions and reducing European dependence on Russian gas and so on, and a lot being done in the economic sphere. I think there's more we could do against Russian intelligence services overseas, which in the end are the basis on which senior members of the regime seek to get their own money offshore, but it's also the platform on which they build much of their subversive activity overseas. And indeed, as they seek to evade sanctions, which will almost certainly be the case as sanctions continue, again, it will be those networks to do it. We dismantled the covert intelligence network in the UK after Salisbury, and I'm sure the security services have kept on that to suppress any rebuilding of it. Others did a lot of diplomatic expulsions, but didn't do the same. And I think it would be in their own national security and our collective security interests were they to do so. So I think there's a whole range of measures we can take to continue to keep the pressure, turn the screw on the Putin regime.
Okay. Mark, you've been watching Russia very closely for a very long time throughout your working career, really, as a security carat in one shape or form. I mean, you rewrote British security doctrine in 2018 after the Salisbury nerve agent attack. Something went wrong, though, quite clearly, because Russia did invade Ukraine. It wasn't put off by the West's response to its greater aggression. One of those things potentially could have been Afghanistan. Russia looked at what happened in Afghanistan, the shambolic withdrawal, and thought the West just doesn't have the spirit for the fight anymore. Do you think that played a part?
I think there is a general belief among autocrats that democracies are weak and decadent. They're wrong about that. But there is a general belief about that. An instance like this, the Syria vote back in 2013, and as you say, last year's withdrawal from Afghanistan, the previous withdrawal from Iraq with essentially the mission incomplete, etc., will undoubtedly have fueled those around Putin and in other autocratic regimes who say, actually, it is worth taking the risk. The West won't respond. I would remind people, however, of what Admiral Yamamoto said after Pearl Harbor, which is we've awoken a sleeping giant. And I think it's pretty clear to me that they have underestimated, the Putin government have underestimated the Western response, the degree to which NATO has come together, that some of the previous frictions, transatlantic or indeed cross-channel, have been set aside. and NATO's response has been robust and effective, and I think will continue to be. And I think autocrats often make this mistake, and the consequences for them, and let's hope again on this occasion, are forbidding.
Fine, let me ask you a little bit about the UK's own posture. The invasion has obviously signified a fairly significant paradigm shift in our and NATO's security relationship with Russia. Does the UK now need to increase its expenditure further, as other countries have done? Obviously, you had an uplift last year. Do we need to go further? Germany, for example, doubling their defence spending up from quite a big low. So Canada, so Australia, etc. Do we need to do that too?
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, I welcome, of course, the increase that we saw last year, but I think that should be across the national security budgets as a whole. It isn't just about the hardware of the military. I'd like to see us restore the DFID budget from the 0.5 to the 0.7 we had before. And people may wonder, well, why is that relevant in the context of Ukraine? But of course, development aid is a really important way of dealing with potential risks of conflict outside Europe, from which the next crisis could arise. I'd like to see us doubling down our investment in intelligence and cyber. I'd like to see us increase our investment in our diplomatic network worldwide, and I think that should be a priority for any government. There are clearly areas of defence that that we could accelerate if more money were available. I don't think that means completely reconfiguring the underlying principles of the integrated review. I think the modernisation of capability, in particular of integrated capability, all arms capability that is flexible and deployable at speed. That's something few other countries can do. So we shouldn't be seeking to reconstitute a modern version of the 20th century force, but I would like to see us investing more in order to be able to accelerate the creation of this genuine 21st century force that we envisaged as we went into the integrated review and towards the end of my time in government.
How much more? So at the moment, we're what, 2.3% of GDP on defence? Would you like to see it go up to 3 or even 3.5%, which is what the Americans spend?
The Americans do spend 3.5%. I think in a sense the exact number and how fast is a sort of one of those issues that governments should wrestle with. I think actually what I would like to see is thinking, what is the national security envelope? So could, for example, we say it'll be 4% on national security, which would be, let's say, 2.5% on defence, or more than that, 2 3/4 on defence, 0.7 on development, with the rest being made up of investment in intelligence and cyber and the diplomatic network, and so on. So I think an envelope of that kind actually would be well worth pursuing, and then that will give governments the opportunity to flex between the different capabilities. Obviously, defence by far the biggest and most expensive over a period. And I think we couldn't go to that straight away, given the fiscal position, but I would like to see something of that kind as a medium-term aim, at least.
Were you therefore a little disappointed that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, didn't announce any new money for defence at all in the spring statement last week? Well,
spring statements are not always the place that this happens, and he had to make a judgment.
Still opportunity.
Indeed, but he had to make a judgment. There's a lot of there's money coming through from defence, and it's not for me to make a judgment about the individual moments. I think what people like me, ex-national security advisors, can do is point to the strategic direction. I would like to see something like a 4% envelope for national security as a whole, with flex between the budgets, to encourage actually that collaboration and integration that we worked so hard on in my time in government. And then governments need to make a judgment about how swiftly they can move in that direction, given all the other priorities and their overall fiscal and economic position.
Okay, and just remind us now where the current national security budget is in total. If you put it all up together, it's obviously not at 4%.
No, it's so with defence at 2.3 and DFID at about development at about 0.5. It's probably hovering around the 3% mark.
Okay. We shall see if your wishes come true, Lord Sedwill. We've got a budget coming up in the autumn. Mark Sedwill, thanks so much for talking to us on TNG.
Tom, good to be with you again. Thank you.
you for inviting me. Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here.